So one day, I had a creepy encounter with my family doctor. I am a 35-year-old woman now, but this encounter happened when I was around 14 or 15 years old, so about 20 years ago now. But the memory is as fresh and as vivid as though it happened yesterday. I haven't even thought of the story in many years until I came across Reddit channels. And after reading some of the other stories, my own personal memory of the story came flooding back. So anyway, everyone in my family, and some still do, used to see this one family doctor for many years for all our medical needs. We'll call him Dr. Deb. We've been seeing this doctor for so long. He was even there at the delivery of my birth, where he held me in his arms when I was just a newborn baby. From then on, I would see him for everything. Every time I got sick, for all my immunizations, etc., etc. So it was only natural that I would go see him the day I needed to get my first pap smear ever done. I had just started becoming sexually active for the first time with my very first boyfriend at this stage, and I had learnt in school sex ed, as well as from other various sources, that once a female starts becoming sexually active, they need to also start getting pap smear tests done. For those who may not know, a pap smear test is a test or procedure done by your doctor to check for cervical cancer in women. The test is not painful in any way, but can feel a little bit strange, uncomfortable, and invasive, as it requires a swab being inserted inside to collect the sample. Other than that, it is a very quick procedure that altogether takes no longer than a minute or two from start to finish. This last point is important to take note of for later in the story. So it's important to note here that even before arriving to my appointment, I was already in a state of feeling a little bit freaked out and uncomfortable with the whole situation, because at 14, I was a lot like most other young girls my age, where I felt very awkward about my growing body, had poor self-image, would often wear baggy clothes to hide any signs of my womanhood from the outside world, such as the breasts that were forming. So the idea that I had to do a test that required I strip from the waist down, sit on a bench with my legs wide open, only to have some random grown-up come right up in there and fiddle around down there sounded to me like the last thing in the world I wanted to do, and was feeling already very embarrassed about it. And even though I was told by many different people that if I wanted, and if it made me more comfortable, I could request for a female doctor to do the test, but for some reason, I had turned that option down. Something I would regret later. I guess I just thought in my head, it's okay. I'll just see Dr. Deb like I always do. I mean, he is my doctor. I've known him for years, so it's only natural I continue to see him and treat this appointment like any other appointment. And I guess I just managed to convince myself to stop being so silly. Everything was fine. And besides, he is a professional doctor who will approach the situation with professionalism and will conduct himself in a way that will not make me feel any more awkward than I already do. How wrong I was. So Dr. Deb tells me to take off everything from the waist down, to lie on the bed, put the white sheet over my lap, and wait for him while he gets everything together. I do this, feeling a bit red in this face, but I do as he asks, hurriedly, as I am impatient to get this over and done with quickly. When he does come around the curtain, he sits down on a low stool right between my legs, whips off the sheet, and looks up at me with a big smile on his face. He then proceeds to have a conversation with me about, I don't remember what about. However, what I do remember was that it wasn't at all relevant to the situation at hand, or anything to do with the test or any medical information in relation to me whatsoever. I just remember that he had chosen that moment to talk about other trivial things like, so how's the family going? Or, what year level are you doing at school now? And things of that nature. Honestly, I wouldn't have been listening to anything he was saying at the time, as all I would have been thinking about is me screaming at him to hurry up and get on with it, and that I do not feel like having a chit-chat with him while my private bits are in his face. But if I had thought for a second that this ill-timed catch-up session would be the most uncomfortable thing to happen in that moment, I would be wrong. As he is chit-chatting away to me, as well as going back and forth between making eye contact with me and flashing me a wide smile to looking down at my private areas with a deep, penetrating gaze, he all of a sudden wraps his hand right around my inner thigh, closest to where my knee is. He does so just gently, almost like he's just resting his hand there for a second, but it makes me do a little jump. He doesn't seem to notice though and continues talking. And as he's talking, I realize that he's slowly started to circle his thumb on my inner thigh in a slow, gentle caress. Immediately, alarm bells start ringing in my head. I'm thinking to myself, what is he doing? The action was almost like he was trying to soothe or relax me in some way, sort of like how a mother might use her hand to do small circular motions on her crying child's back in an attempt to soothe. But why? Was I maybe being outwardly obvious about how uncomfortable I was with the situation, despite my best efforts to not let it show? And even if it was obvious to Dr. Deb, is it normal for a doctor to do this soothing action on a patient? And on top of this, how much longer is this whole damn thing going to take anyway? I thought this was meant to be a real quick procedure. That's when deep down I started to realize that something was very wrong with the situation. Or that I started to sense his intentions weren't good or appropriate at all. Because he started to move his hand slowly up my inner thigh, towards my private area, still caressing me with his thumb, and still gazing directly at me as he went. It's when his hand reached its destination, and not because he was about to do the swab at that stage, but to continue just to caress me, that my legs started to shake uncontrollably. Not for any other reason than the fact that I was scared, and I just couldn't stop myself from shaking in fear. Then 2 seconds later, the tears started to slowly form and roll down my face as I let out a little whimpering sound. Of course, Dr. Deb immediately noticed this, but doesn't at all stop or spring back like you would hope he would do in that situation, as though he might be realizing what he's doing is wrong and decides to stop what he's doing. And he just continues to do it more intensely and says to me, "Honey, you're shaking. What's wrong? Why are you feeling so nervous? Don't be nervous, honey. Just try and relax. Everything's fine," and just continues to caress me. It's almost like he believes his words and actions are actually helping me to relax when quite clearly, it's doing the complete opposite. But for some reason, I don't say a word. I don't tell him to stop or back off. I don't move a muscle, other than the uncontrollable shake that I can't help. What's even more baffling about my behavior and reaction at this point is, I even quickly try to wipe away and hide my tears from him so he doesn't see it. Because for some reason, in that moment, I feel bad for him, because I'm worried my tears and distress might be making his job harder in some way by me being a challenging or uncooperative patient. I can't explain why I thought or reacted this way other than the fact that I was just a young 14-year-old girl who was freaking out, and just didn't know what to do in an unsettling situation. And especially because it was happening with someone I knew my entire life and had looked up to and trusted for a very long time. Anyway, it relieves me to say that he eventually did perform the test, and that this story doesn't end with any further graphic details of some sort of sexual assault or anything of that nature. He did, however, act completely oblivious to my distress throughout the whole thing, acted the whole way through like he wasn't doing anything wrong and that everything was normal. Oh, and remember how earlier I mentioned this test should only take usually 1 to 2 minutes at most to complete? I was on that table for 15 minutes with him, which might not be a long amount of time, but to me, it felt like years in that moment. Do you know what the worst part is? The moment I got home to my parents, I burst into tears, flung myself into their arms, and proceeded to tell them the entire story. As freaked out as I was, within seconds I started to feel better, just knowing that I was back within the safety net of their presence, but also knowing that once I finished telling them what happened, that my parents would know what to do to fix the situation as well as offer me much-needed comfort. But you know what? That's not what I got. What I got was being immediately thrusted out of their embrace and then straight away got the biggest telling-off session of my life. They didn't believe a word I said. In fact, they got so angry at me for being a troublemaker and making up stories about their trusted family doctor, who they have known for years and knew for a fact wouldn't ever do anything of what I was accusing him of. Then, they told me to stop crying and immediately grounded me. I was in complete and utter shock, and to this day, I'm still not sure which one is worse my doctor did. or my own family's reaction to the situation. Both experiences ended up hurting me deeply. So, nothing ever came of the situation. I had to bottle it up inside and bury it all away, and he got away with it. The only thing I had in my power to do was make the decision to never see him again, which I haven't to this day. There had been plenty of times where I had thought about reporting him to police, especially fearing for the well-being of any other women out there in his care, but after how my parents reacted, I convinced myself that the police probably wouldn't believe me either if it came to me against him. I believed I would lose, so stayed silent. I just truly hope that nothing awful has ever happened at his own hands to anybody else after my experience. This first started happening 15 years ago and would take place over the next 13 years of my life. It all started in the summertime, about 4 months after we had moved to a new house in a different state. I was 9 years old at the time, and I didn't really have any friends in the area. One day I was out in the front yard helping my dad with yard work. He would mow the front and backyards, and I would either pick dandelions out of the ground or water the plants at the front of the house. Not super helpful, I know, but I was 9 and wasn't allowed to do anything with the lawnmower besides maybe pull the cord to start the motor. My dad had just finished the front yard and had moved his way to the backyard, while I stayed in the front yard to finish up. I remember seeing a package on the porch in front of our door and going up to pick it up, and that was when I turned around and saw him. A man in his late 30s, with long dark hair tied in a ponytail hanging down past his shoulders, wearing a plain white t-shirt, black pajama pants, and no socks or shoes. He was standing at the end of our street, standing with his arms crossed and staring directly at me. Now for context, my house is 4 houses down from the end of the street. At the end of my street, there is a road that forms a T-shaped intersection. On the other side of this intersection from my house, there are 3 houses, with one house lined up with the middle of my street and the other 2 houses sitting to the right of it. To the left of the house lined up with my street is an old steel treating factory that existed surrounded by houses in our neighborhood, and at that time was still active 24/7. This man was standing in front of the house lined up with my street, at the top of the T-shaped intersection. He was standing right off the edge of the street and in front of what I assumed was his house, just staring at me. As soon as I saw him, I immediately froze and stared back at him, with a sudden uneasy feeling washing over me. The longer I looked at him, the more red flags I began to notice. To my 9-year-old mind, this man was dressed very strangely, and that had already been an immediate red flag. But the creepiest thing that stood out to me was his face. His face had absolutely no expression of any kind. There was just this intense and piercing stare with him looking directly at me. It felt like he was staring right through me, and for at least 2 minutes we stared at each other, never looking away or even blinking. Eventually, the uneasy feeling built up enough for me to slowly walk myself down off the porch and over to the side of our house, never looking away from the man. When I made it out of sight, I ran to the backyard to tell my dad about what had just happened. I came up to him as he finished mowing the backyard and described what I had seen, and that was when he told me that he had seen this man the other day doing the same thing, except just staring straight down our street. Arms crossed, plain white t-shirt, pajama pants, no shoes, just like when I had seen him. After that, my dad told me that he thought that man seemed off and to stay far away from him. Unfortunately, that would not be the last time that I saw the man at the end of our street. From that point on, I would see this man much more often. I would be riding in the car with my family or outside doing something in our yard or on our block, and I would look over and see him standing in the same spot, arms crossed, intensely staring. He wasn't there 24/7, but at least 3 days a week I would see him outside, sometimes for 5 or more hours at a time. If not staring at me, staring at someone walking their dog or a car passing by. Once I tried to figure out his schedule so I wouldn't have to be around him as much, but it felt too creepy keeping track of him because he would occasionally start scanning his head around looking for people to lock onto, which really creeped me out. Now some of you may be thinking, he's just staring and not doing anything. That's not that bad, right? Well, sadly, I would later find out that things were far worse than I had ever imagined. So fast forward about 9 years. I am now 18 years old and looking to get a job to save up for my first car. I hadn't really been able to save any money up to that point, and my parents weren't in any position to be able to help me with purchasing one. So I knew that I had to try and find a job that would be easy for me to get to and that would pay me enough for me to hopefully get a cheap car quickly. Lo and behold, the steel treating factory next to the creepy man's house has a now hiring sign out front, and I decided that a 2-minute walk to work had to be worth it, even if it meant walking by creepy man's house. I had seen this guy doing this routine for almost a decade at this point and figured that it wasn't going to be a problem. So I apply and end up getting the job. It was hard work, which usually consisted of heavy physical labor and keeping up a constant pace, but nothing I hadn't expected. I started off fairly slowly but ended up getting much better and able to do tasks much faster. About 3 months in, I was assigned to work on a machine that I had not previously worked on, located in the loading dock. From the loading dock, I had a clear view of the wooden fence that separated the factory loading zone from the creepy man's house, as well as the front of his driveway where he would normally stand. I couldn't see the man standing at his post, but I was able to notice a large hole in the fence, which seemed like it had been made in some kind of accident. The fence was not broken cleanly, but there were splinters and cracks in the fence where the hole had been made. I asked the floor worker who was with me at the dock, let's call him Ronnie, if he knew anything about this, and this actually got us into a longer conversation about the creepy man. Ronnie had been with the steel treating factory for over 15 years, and had seen the man during his staring routine more than once. According to Ronnie, the hole in the fence had been made by creepy man, and he had told the managers of the plant that it had been an accident with his truck. But that's not all. Ronnie then went on to tell me that creepy neighbor guy actually runs a daycare out of his house, and that it was an unregistered business and has actually led to police being called on him more than once. This surprised me, as I had never seen the police over at his house before. But after Ronnie told me this, something else occurred to me. When looking at creepy man's house, whenever his van wasn't sitting in the driveway, you could see one of those children's mini playgrounds with a slide and toys built into it, the kind toddlers would play with. This always struck me as odd because never once in those 9 years up to that point had I ever seen anybody else come or go from his house, especially not any children. But I had never really dedicated much thought into it. After Ronnie told me this, I thought back to when I had first seen him as a 9-year-old and all the other times he had stared at me growing up, and I began to wonder if he had been secretly plotting to try and get me over to his unofficial daycare. Sadly, I couldn't really confirm what Ronnie had told me, and at this point I had been dealing with my own personal problems at home, and so I just filed the story into the back of my head as something I would not at all be surprised to find out was true. I left that job not long after this. I had saved up the money I needed for a car and was able to make my way into the career field I had been hoping to make it into. Fast forward to 3 years later, and to one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me and the reason for my posting this. At this point, I had moved away from home, but ended up having to move back home with my parents for reasons I'm not going to get into. I had also met my girlfriend, and we would spend some nights driving over to my parents' house to watch old movies or play games with my janky basement setup. By this point, my girlfriend was aware of the creepy man but paid him as much mind as anybody else. As creepy as he wasn't breaking the law by standing there, and our lives already had too much going on for us to be focusing our time and attention on his weirdness. On this night, I was driving home with my girlfriend for a normal night of watching movies. I didn't want to block my mother's car in on our single-lane driveway, so I had recently started parking in the grass patch behind our house. Behind our house was an alley that ran past everybody's backyards. Our backyard had a wooden fence up against the alley, with a separate garage building which opened up into the alley. I had started to park in the grass patch area in between the garage doors and the alley more often, and so that was the direction I had been driving home, silently hoping to myself that the creepy man wouldn't be outside on a pleasant night like this. Well, of course, I had jinxed it, and the way home that I was going ended up taking us right past him, standing and staring us down. I locked eyes with him very briefly as we drove past him, headed to the right side of the T intersection to turn into the alley to go behind my house. But here's where things got scary. For some reason, I don't know why, as we passed by the creepy man, I got a really bad feeling. A feeling very similar to the day I had first seen him. A gut-wrenching something is wrong kind of feeling. And so I decided to look in my driver's side mirror. To my horror, the creepy man had actually left his post and started walking quickly in my direction. I can honestly say that this was the first time I had ever seen the creepy man not standing completely still, and here he was walking the same direction I had gone. As my thoughts started racing, I turned into the alleyway and then went 4 houses down, turning into the grass patch behind the garage in our backyard. I immediately told my girlfriend what I had seen and how strange it was. I did not want to freak her out, but I didn't want her to get blindsided if something bad was about to happen. From the angle that my car was parked, I could turn around in my driver's seat and stare at the alleyway through the slits in the wooden fence in our backyard. I would be able to see if he was coming and see if he rounded the corner. I locked my car doors, turned in my seat and reached into my pocket to tightly grip my pocket knife. My eyes widened and my heart started beating fast as I saw him casually walking down the alley through the slits, right up to the edge of the wooden fence, and then pause. After a few moments, he turned around 180 degrees and started walking back down the alley in the direction he had come from. I waited about 2 minutes before getting out of my car and slowly approaching the edge of the fence, then walking into the alley to see that he was gone. I have thought about this quite a bit since it happened 2 years ago. I don't actually know if he recognized me or the house that I had pulled into, or why he chose that night to follow me and my girlfriend and scare the hell out of us. Honestly, I don't really care. I was able to move out of that house shortly after that happened and am now living with my girlfriend, who today is my fiancé. But to the man that stared at me and my entire neighborhood for over half my life, and who followed me and my girlfriend into a dark alley for God knows what reason. This happened almost a year ago now, but it's something I still think about whenever I go grocery shopping, especially when I'm alone. One day my boyfriend, 31 male, and I, 25 female, had planned to make some dinner together while I spent the night at his place during our weekend. We work food service jobs, so we have 2 weekdays off back-to-back together to spend time with each other. We just needed some veggies and a couple of odd ingredients like oil, so we just planned to go in and out for this trip. I'll be referring to him as David. To give some context on why this situation was so strange, I have to describe my boyfriend and myself. We live in a pretty extroverted community where everybody talks to everybody. So, even though it's not technically a small town, the behavior is very similar. I am not a local but have lived here for about 7 years now, while David has lived here for almost his entire life. When he was younger, he made some shitty decisions for himself and ended up doing some jail time, a long probation, and is now a convicted felon, drug-related for those curious. He hasn't reoffended, however, since his crime. It was about 11 years ago now, I think. And when I met him while he was still on probation, I made it very clear that if he ever reoffended, I'd kick his ass and leave him. Unfortunately, word got around of what happened and he and his family became more of a gossip topic within the community. People sneer at him if they recognize him, and they always give me a look of pity or disgust because I seem like such a sweet, honest girl. Whatever, I pay them no mind. We usually get a lot of stares while out in public, not only because of his background, but because we're interracial. He's covered in tattoos. I've got a few myself, piercings, and we dress more in the alternative style. It's not super common in our area. To sum it all up, people leave like bats out of hell when they see us together. So imagine my surprise when I send off David to go grab some peppers. They were on the opposite side of the produce section where I was at. While I finished grabbing the avocados that I needed, and not even 3 seconds later a random man was on the other side of the produce section I was standing in. "Those avocados looking good?" I knew what he said. I'd heard it, but I didn't register it because I'm not used to people approaching me in public, let alone speaking to me. I also tend to have a pretty mean look on my face when I'm relaxed. I was just stunned that he was actually speaking with me more than anything. He pointed and looked down at the avocados while repeating himself. "The avocados. Looking good. Yeah? I guess." I thought the conversation would end there, and I stopped looking at him and went back to browsing the avocados. Bad move on my part. Again, with almost an unnerving amount of excitement, he had moved around the produce aisle. This is what was keeping us apart, to give you an idea of how quickly he'd closed the space between us. And he was about a foot away from me now. I backed up out of habit, since I really don't like having people I don't know in my personal space, but he just moved forward to close the distance again. "My name is John, by the way. It's very nice to meet you." Again, I was shocked that somebody was talking to me at all, considering who I'm with, but his upbeat attitude and outgoing behavior didn't really surprise me, since literally everybody is like that in this area. He had short brown hair, glasses, and he was dressed pretty smart. Think a relaxed Urkel without the suspenders. "Hey John. I'm OP. Nice to meet you." At this point, I'm getting uncomfortable, because I'm already regretting giving this guy my name, and I'm wondering where the hell David is at. I'm also mildly irritated. I am in no way a friendly-looking woman. I'm very tall, a little over 6 feet, and I have a pretty tanky build, as David puts it. Why did this guy think I was approachable at all? And even though he was a little shorter than me, and I initially didn't feel threatened, I just felt off. He was way too happy to have met a random woman who was just shopping on her own, and he was really physically invasive, as every time I moved away from him, he would casually but also not so subtly close the distance again. At this point, I was panicking and trying to mentally communicate to David, because "Dude, where the fuck are you?" as I'm just politely nodding and giving tight-lipped awkward smiles to the guy as he keeps talking to me. He's telling me small talk things like where he's from, how long he's been in the area, how lovely it is, etc. But again, it all just felt very disingenuine. Just wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. The entire encounter, me just being alone with him, couldn't have lasted for more than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity while I kept scanning for David behind John. I finally managed to glance over to the area where the peppers would have been, and I see him. And when I tell you, I've never seen David look so infuriated and territorial at the same time. We locked eyes, and I think he could just feel how uncomfortable I was. But as soon as I widened my eyes, because oh my god, help me, what the fuck, he moved so fast. For any Lot fans, think Gollum when he attacks Sam. The look in his eyes wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, and he was zigzagging between produce stands. This will be important. I physically relaxed as I saw him approaching, and within seconds he was cutting off John and inserting himself between us. "Hey, what's going on, man? Helping out my girlfriend." At first glance, David isn't that intimidating. He honestly looks like an Urkel himself, just punked out with loads of tattoos and piercings. But he has a really, honestly overwhelming energy no matter how he's feeling. And he was pissed. It reeked off of him as John stuttered. I watched as his face dropped, just for a second, and he looked beyond irritated that David had swooped in the way that he did. But he recovered fast and just reintroduced himself. Sorry. My name is John. I was just talking to OP here. She's so nice." "Yeah, she is." The tension was extremely thick and I was nervous. More so just watching David to make sure he didn't do anything that could get him in trouble. People here are already 911 happy over much more trivial things. I could already see them salivating at getting a known criminal in the area arrested again because, see, I knew it. He's bad news. He's doing the same thing he did to me with David, introducing where he's from, how long he's been in the area, not very long, honestly, now that I remember, and he's just so nice that neither of us really felt comfortable completely cutting him off. But David and I shared a look, and we both for sure had the same thought. Why me? This guy looked like every other person in the area, and would most likely have a much better and easier time striking up a friendly conversation. What about me made it that he wanted to speak with me? I'll admit I watch and listen to a lot of true crime shows/podcasts, so some of the things that John was saying made alarm bells ring in my head almost immediately. He mentioned that he had met some sort of mentor. That's the part that really had me furrowing my brows. How they had saved him. I don't know if he was being gender neutral or if there was more than one person, and that he really wanted to just live his life in the purest way possible, and how he was just looking for some friends. David is a legend at being very nice but extremely firm, and he kept doing so with John, but he just kept wiggling around and reintroducing how he just wanted to be friends with us. At this point, David was fed up, and I was just wanting to finish our shopping so we could go home and make dinner. The whole thing was making me feel weird, and I just wanted out. We don't have any friends, David told him flatly, but John just pushed around that and kept prodding. Oh, I can't imagine that's true with how friendly you both are. Do you have any social media? Like Instagram?
No.
I don't really have socials considering I'm already well known at the county justice system. At this point, I see David tensing up while John just kind of swallows in an uncomfortable manner, but he's still not backing down. I could tell that the two of them at this point were either going to get unfriendly in a verbal manner, and the last thing I wanted was a physical fight, so I took over. I do though. Here, type in your handle and follow yourself so you can have my account. Before you all panic, I have a dud account that I use for creeps that won't leave me alone when I'm out alone with my girlfriends or family. It just gets them off my back easier, and they don't ever get to see my actual profile. The smile he gave was not genuine. Kind of sinister actually, with the way he felt and looked relieved. He immediately reached for my phone. He pulled out his phone to verify that it worked, and he then said goodbye and just left us. Just like that. David watched him go while simultaneously wrapping his arm around me. That was weird. I wonder. Wait until we check out. We have what we need, I'll come get the rest later. David was scanning the area, and at this point I went from weirded out to straight up concerned. David can be pretty paranoid due to his past and the way that people treat him, but this wasn't his usual paranoia. He was actively looking around, and he refused to leave me by myself again. His arm never left me even at self-checkout. He once again kept kind of glaring around at everybody just to ensure we wouldn't get approached again, and he only relaxed once we were in his car and the doors were locked. What was that all about? You've never acted like that. You were being flanked. I felt my blood run cold as soon as he said that, and I just kind of stuttered as I asked him to clarify what he meant. That crazed look in his eye, the one he had as he zigzagged between stands to get to me? He told me it was because he was angry, he was confused, but more than anything he was scared. He was afraid he wouldn't get to me in time. Again, on the verge of freaking out, I asked him what he was talking about. David said that he already knew I was uncomfortable, and he was pissed off because John was way too close to me for his comfortability. But he only started moving the way he did because he noticed another man behind me, watching John and I's interaction. David, again, has lived here almost his entire life, and he said he'd never seen the guy before. He was wearing dark blue jeans, a black hoodie, and he was about as tall as I was, and he was just standing there, staring right at me. He was also moving closer to me while John was kind of talking my ear off, and his boiling point was when he noticed the other man was getting close enough to just grab onto my purse, or worse in his mind, me. Once he got near enough to make eye contact with the second man behind me, the guy bolted straight towards another man that was watching from a distance. He said the two of them exchanged quick words, and then they just disappeared around a different aisle deeper into the grocery store. That was why he didn't let go of me, and why he kept surveillancing the store. He wanted to ensure the same guys weren't following us around the store, including John. Everything else made sense, except for the zigzagging motion he was doing while essentially floating over from the peppers. When I asked him why he was zigzagging like that to get to me, just because it looked odd and I couldn't figure out what the significance of it was, he got really quiet when he started up his car and started pulling out of the lot before he answered me. I was going to pick up one of those produced scales and use it if they got their hands on you. I didn't even want to think about that as I reassured him that I was safe, thanks to him no less, and that I was going to block the guy on Instagram. Before I did that, David suggested we snoop just to see if he had some weird stuff on his Instagram, and it looked surprisingly normal at first glance. But a lot of the photos were taken in a headshot-like style, with a very empty smile from John's face with random emojis as captions, or just straight-up locations of random cities. Probably areas he was traveling around. Any landscape photos he did happen to post were always somewhere in the desert. These photos he never tagged a location on. As we were snooping, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered something. Instagram has a feature where you can tag your location in any photo that you post. Like I said, I watch/listen to a lot of true crime, so that's a feature that I disabled and actively avoided enabling whenever I made a post on my private Instagram. People are just crazy, and honestly, it just felt weird having a bunch of people I know and barely knew from high school just having my exact location whenever I posted it. I didn't share it with David, just because he truly doesn't have any social media and I didn't want to freak him out more. But I'm pretty sure the guy was relieved to receive my Instagram because that meant he'd have a general location of where I live. He'd know where I was, or at least what areas I frequented, and who knows what he would have done with information like that. I promptly blocked the account and shoved it deep down into my brain, wanting to forget about the whole thing. We don't shop at that same grocery store anymore, and we haven't seen John anywhere else in town. But I still think about it sometimes when I need to make a quick trip to the grocery store.